Hey moms, it's Nakimi. Welcome to the channel and space for single moms navigating motherhood. And as always, we do not bash the baby daddies because, well, we are here now. So I made a video previously talking about, addressing single moms and, giving advice on what to do when people are gossiping about you or judging you, for your parenting style. And one of the things that I said in the video that I talked about was, being able to receive correction, but the delivery of that correction or advice or message is just as much as important, if not more, than the message itself. I remember growing up and, hearing my grandmothers and great grandmothers tell me about, talk about how times were. Oftentimes, back in the day, generations ago, when the young women, teenage girls came home pregnant, they would be kicked out. Sometimes it was a situation where like they were living with their mother who was a single mom who had, 5-6 kids. And so, maybe they're the eldest and, they were kind of having to look after, their siblings while their mom worked 2 jobs, just to make ends meet. And so, if they came up pregnant, then, their mom would be like, you've got to go because I can't afford to, you know, um, feed another mouth, or they had dads, the dads that were married couples that would still, disown the child because they didn't want to be embarrassed by that, or they were so heavily in their religion that you can't do that here. Speaking of with the church, a lot of churches, if there was a young woman that became pregnant and she was not married, she had to stand before the congregation and repent of that sin. But something that I did notice back then, and even sometimes today, the boys were never held accountable. The shame was never placed on them, right? It was almost as if it was kind of expected, you brought this kid into this world, you're going to be the one to take care of it. That's how they coined the phrase, mama, baby, daddy, maybe. Mama's baby, daddy's maybe, or in an effort to, their way of, the elders, the old mother's way of, preventing their teenage daughters from getting pregnant, they would tell them, don't bring no baby here. If you woman enough to go open your legs and have one, you're going to be the one to take care of it. Or something that grandmas would, say, or, older women would tell him is, don't be waking up, you got a man over there. Don't just wake up with a wet behind and nothing to show for it. And although those messages are true, right? If it's your responsibility to take care of the child that you bring into this world, and no, you don't want to be, shacking up with a man and you're working and he's not doing anything but just sitting around, and it happened a lot. I grew up seeing a family member or two doing that, where they work really hard and the husband, just child, he was at home watching TV all day, so it happened. But I think I think the mark was missed on educating those girls and providing a safe space, because although the message in itself is nothing but facts, the delivery was off. It was almost as if, if you commit this sin, I'm going to disown you. You're not going to have anybody, as a fear tactic, and I get why they were doing it because they were in survival mode. So, being able to sit down with the kids and be vulnerable and be honest about their story. You know, a lot of, adults even today don't open up to their kids and share their story. I have. You know, I've sat down and gave my daughter testimonies of some of my, of my errors. You know, not everything she knows, but I'm very vulnerable with my kid. I want her to know, you can't just say, don't do this because I'm not going to take care of that baby. I've explained to her how hard it was, what it does to you mentally, physically, etc., And I think more parents, should do it. And I think if that had been done back in the day, instead of kicking them out, when you kick them out, they have no support. They're out on the streets. They've had to drop out of high school, and if the baby daddies drop them like a bad habit, all of a sudden now they have cooties and, he's just so disgusted and he's no longer in love. And, now he's ready to focus on whatever else, they were already feeling shame, they're getting it from the church, they're getting it from school, kids in the neighborhood is talking, teenage girls gossip again, like they're Wendy Williams, how you do it, So I don't know. I just think that there was never really a correct way that they were educated. It was just always, coming at them with shame. So bringing you guys to current times, if you think about it now and you see, 22-year-olds, 5 kids, 3 different baby daddies. Maybe she started when she was, 14, 15, or 16, 17, and just been having them back to back. You've got to give them a little grace. And I'm going to tell you why. It's because obviously there is some cognitive disconnect there. Back in the day in the 1920s and 30s and before that, birth control and stuff, that wasn't a thing. My grandmother and great grandparents, so their generation was having, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 kids. So out of all those children, and you got one mom, every last one of those kids had a need that was unmet. And then you got the older siblings that were responsible for the younger siblings. So they're placed into, they're not able to just be kids and grow up, right? They're already placed in a position of, I've got to be, a mother almost. So you pass that mentality down to the next generation, So if you see, if you know of a woman or a family member that is, in that situation, don't judge. And if you're going to give them correction, make sure that it is rooted in love, from a place of, hey, I'm concerned about you, especially if you're close with that, with that family member. Y'all are like A Spoon Coons, tell them, hey, cuz, hey, sis, whatever, I'm a little concerned, let's take a walk. Have you thought about getting into therapy? I don't know, And I'm not saying coddle someone and enable them. And I'm not saying, there's not times where you just got to flat out tell a person the truth. But again, your delivery should always be rooted in love so that they can receive it. I mean, think about, when you're in a relationship with your man and you're doing something that he doesn't like, you'll be quite upset, if he comes in and it's like, I'm tired of this. Why aren't you doing that? I hate when you do that. That really just irks me, bro. However they say it nowadays, versus, hey, babe, can I talk to you for a second? I really don't like this. It kind of makes me feel a certain type of way. You're probably going to receive the latter, because you're going to probably not feel like he's attacking you. And so again, I'm not saying coddle, women of society that are making poor choices at all. I'm not. But I think that there has been a communication disconnect, Maybe, those women obviously have some type of mental issue going on. And when I say like mental illness going on, it's not always like serious mental illness. It could be that they're somewhere on the spectrum. It could be that they're suffering from PTSD. Maybe they have childhood trauma that, that they don't know about, or they haven't, received help for. And especially if they were raised, by a single mom, and, their siblings and them also have different dads. Well, it's just a repeated cycle. So, I don't know. I just think that the delivery of a lot of the way, Black women received back then, as far as the delivery of advice and things like that, it was very harsh, and it didn't connect. It didn't connect. They shut down, and they didn't know, because they were babies. The information wasn't given to them at their level where they can understand. Most importantly, they didn't have those examples to kind of mimic, So I don't know. That's my think piece on it, guys. Let me know what you think about it in the comments. Make sure you guys subscribe, comment, and like. Stay tuned for my next video, because I'm really going to be diving into and talking about my thoughts on isolating. If you are a single mom and you don't have any support, or maybe, you're going through something, with your baby daddy, and you've been thinking about, moving and things like that, I'm going to really provide my think piece on that. So as always, you got this, mamas. I love you guys. Okay.